mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals, more specifically about number lines counting by halves. To get us started, we have a number line here with a few whole numbers. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Notice that in between each whole number, we have two spaces. So as we see here, it takes two spaces to get from 0 to 1. It takes two spaces to get from 1 to 2. Two spaces to get from 2 to 3, two spaces to get from 3 to 4, and two spaces to get from 4 to 5. So in between each whole number, it takes two spaces. So it takes two spaces to make a whole. So because it takes two spaces to make each whole, that means we're going to be counting by 1 over 2, okay? Because it takes two spaces out of two spaces to make one whole. So as we can see here, we have 1 over 2, and then we have 2 over 2, which is equal to 1. So if we continue using this pattern, the next one is going to be 3 over 2. 3 over 2 is an improper fraction that can be written as 1.5, which makes sense because this is in between 1 and 2. Then after 3 over 2, we're going to continue the pattern and we have 4 over 2, which is equivalent to 2, which makes sense because they're on the same line. Then we have 5 over 2, which is an improper fraction that can be written as 2.5. Then we have 6 over 2, which can be written as 3. Then we have 7 over 2, which is an improper fraction that can be written as 3.5. Then we have 8 over 2, which is equivalent to 4. And then we have 9 over 2, which is an improper fraction that can be written as 4.5. And then we have 10 over 2, which is equivalent to 5. Now, the improper fractions help us with the pattern, but essentially we're counting up by halves. So if we take all these improper fractions, we can write them as whole numbers or mixed numbers, so we don't need the ones above. And so notice that this number line is counting up by halves because there's two spaces in between each whole number, so we're counting up by 1 over 2. Now, if we had a vertical number line that was also having two spaces in between each whole number, we would count up by the same thing. So if there's two spaces in between 0 and 1, we would count up by halves. So we have half, and then we have 1, and then we have 1.5, and then we have 2, and then we have 2.5, then we have 3, then we have 3.5, 4, 4.5, and 5. So our vertical number line would be counted the same way as long as there's still two spaces in between each whole number here, which there is. So now we're going to go ahead and take these values and write them in decimal form. So in order to write a half as a decimal, we have to go ahead and divide the numerator by the denominator. That means we have to take 1 and divide it by 2. Now 1 is going to be our dividend and 2 is going to be our divisor. We ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 1? Well, it doesn't, so that means we're going to add a 0 here. And then after the 1, we're going to add a decimal point and a 0. Make sure that when we're dividing with a decimal, we bring up the decimal point. And then we're going to ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 10? So we're going to ignore the decimal point for right now because we brought it up. And 2 goes into 10 5 times, and that's because 2 times 5 is equal to 10. So we're going to write that value, and then we're going to subtract. So 10 minus 10 is equal to 0. So that means that 1 over 2, written as a decimal, is 5/10. So now that we know that half is 5/10, when we have a number line with decimals, we're going to be increasing by 5/10. So if we add another 5/10, we actually get 1 whole. And then if we add another 5/10, we get 1 and 5/10. If we add another 5/10, we get 2. If we add another 5/10, we get 2 and a half, so 2 and 5/10. And then if we add another 5/10, we get 3. If we add another 5/10, we get 3 and 5/10. If we add another 5/10, we get 4. If we add another 5/10, we get 4 and 5/10. If we add another 5/10, we get 5, and that's it. So we're increasing by 5/10. That's the decimal form of a half. So we could just visualize it using the decimals if we get rid of the mixed numbers. So here we have a vertical number line, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add our decimals here. So because we're counting up by 2 spaces and we know 1/2 is 5/10, we're going to label the value in between 0 and 1 as 5/10. 5/10 plus 5/10 is 1. If we add another 5/10, we get 1 and 5/10. If we add another one, we get 2. Then we get 2 and 5/10. Then we get 3. And then we get 3 and 5/10. Then we get 4. And then 4 and 5/10. And then finally, we have 5. And that's it for using number lines counting by halves.